Okay, so this is our first lecture of the year, and it's an introduction into what is science. Now, this is a science class, but this won't be about the topic that we cover throughout the year. This is just about science in general, a little bit about what it is, and then a whole lot of what science does for us as a society. So, here is just the definition you get when you type in science into Google. The intellectual and practical activity encompassing the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. Or in other words, science is the process of figuring out how stuff works, and we do that through observation and the scientific experiment. It's the opposite of intuition, luck, faith, speculation, authority, etc. Because in science, we do actual tests. There isn't really a way to test your intuition or your luck. Luck is one of those things that you only can assess after the fact, for example. Science, we have the experiment, and the experiment proves whether our hypothesis was true or not true. So, when we look at the natural world, it's full of all kinds of things that just beg to be explained. Like this, for example. What the heck is going on? We have blue glowing water. Well, this is a kind of bacteria, and they release light when they're stressed. It's called bioluminescence. So, if you were to walk down this beach, your footprint would actually light up bright blue, and it would leave a trail as you walked along. Now, what kind of myths and stories do you think people in the way distant past would have made about this kind of thing? Because they didn't know it was bacteria. You can't see the things. The Northern Lights. What kinds of legends and stories did people come up with to try and explain what was going on? Today, we know that it's interactions between solar radiation and the Earth's magnetic field. This is an algae bloom. Sometimes they can be this sort of blood red color. So we can think of a story like the 10 plagues of Egypt, where the river ran red. Well, this kind of thing really happens. So, we can imagine that story adopted something that really happens in nature. Now, would they have actually thought it's blood? Maybe. People used to believe in curses and things like that. This sort of ordinary-looking mountain is actually Mount Olympus in Greece. People thought that gods lived up there and controlled everybody's lives. They had a god for the weather. They had a god for the harvest. They had one for food and wine and all kinds of things. They prescribed agents of cause for their daily lives. And they, for some reason, thought they lived up here. You'd think Mount Olympus would look a little more, legendary. But that's it. So this landscape, the Grand Canyon, how could something so incredible have been shaped? Well, through erosion. But for huge chunks of Earth's history, people believed that the Earth, with all of its features that it has currently, is the way Earth has always been. Every mountain has always existed. Every valley has always existed. And the Earth hasn't been around for very long. Well, today, now we know that the Earth is really incredibly old, and that features like this form over very, very, very slow periods of time. And then we just look at the sheer diversity of life that's on our planet. Everything from, we have single-celled bacteria here, plants, fungi, the rest of these are animals. Where does this come from? Another thing that people used to believe. All the plants and animals and everything on Earth were created all at once, and they've always been here. Well, no. You take a monkey like this one. There used to be dinosaurs roaming this Earth, and there were none of these monkeys when those dinosaurs were there. But, it took science and took a lot of time and discovery before we figured that kind of thing out. So, the word science has only existed the way we understand it today for around 250 years. The word is older than that, but it was used in different ways. the word scientist actually was coined by a Cambridge historian in only the year 1834. But we think of sort of these older people we thought of scientists like Isaac Newton, Galileo. Well, what were they? The word they used was natural philosophers. So in places like ancient Egypt, Greece, Rome, and the Middle East, people didn't practice what we would consider science because there's a scientific method. You probably know what it is. And these people at this time didn't use the scientific method. Instead, famous people who we think kind of were scientists like Aristotle, Archimedes, Pythagoras, they just sort of guessed. Now, to be fair, there's an announcement. To be fair, Aristotle was sort of the guesser. He did all kinds of thought experiments where he would try to explain part of the world or the cosmos just through logic and reason. I'll get back to that in a second. Pythagoras and Archimedes were mathematicians, so you don't really guess with math. They were very good. But Archimedes famously developed weapons for the Hellenistic army, the Greek army. And his story is actually interesting. He was around at the time when Rome was taking over Greece, and a Roman soldier actually killed Archimedes because Archimedes was working on a math problem. The Roman soldier demanded that he stop, and Archimedes just kept working, and so he stabbed him to death. Good job, Rome. Now, Aristotle, this idea is very, very, very old, and it continued for an extremely long time. Aristotle lived around 400 BC, and from that time all the way up until around the 14 and 1500s, people took Aristotle and the Bible and other works like that as ultimate truths, like authority figures, kind of. And the reason sort of for that, I think, when you look at Aristotle and you look at why he studied the world the way he did, he thought that everything in the universe has its place and has its role, and he looked in himself and looked at people, and he realized what makes people different from other animals is our ability to be rational and to use our reason. So that is exclusively what he used to explain things. He just used reason. He said, well, based on what I can see and what I know, I think it must be this. And that was good enough for people for an extremely long time, but that is not science, because we know that our senses can deceive us, and we're wrong most of the time, actually. So there's a term for this today. We call it armchair philosophy, and unfortunately it's still very common. If you listen to like a politician talking about their policy, they don't really tend to use statistics or anything like that. They just say, I think this, therefore this is going to happen, so vote for me and we can do XYZ, whatever. Watch the news and you'll see exactly what I mean. And it kind of has its uses, armchair philosophy. We can't just go scientific method on every single thing that there is. So the scientific method, though, was actually created by Francis Bacon in that book Novum Organum. I have no idea what that means. It's Latin. And he wrote that in 1620. So the scientific process has only been laid out for that long. But if you think about where we were in 1620 versus where we are today, or even think about where we were 100 years ago versus where we are today with technology and quality of life and everything, just think of how fast everything has changed. And it's all thanks to this new paradigm. So science tends to only be concerned with natural explanations. Don't bother with the supernatural. You can't do an experiment on things like that. And science also tends to avoid addressing questions of value. So a question of preference is not scientifically valid. Science doesn't exactly tell you what you should do or what you should like. Not really. But I do think that science is what shapes our moral compass. And science is the main thing that has driven society towards more progress for people. And I'm going to try to outline that here. So before the modern scientific movement, which began pretty much in the middle 1500s with Copernicus, people's values and attitudes and what they claimed to know was very, very, very different. And that's true no matter what period of time you travel back to. So let's think about people who lived in 1500s Europe. People who lived at that time were majority very spiritual and Christian people, and they relied on their beliefs to guide their opinions, and that's like a lot of Americans today. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. Not really. We all do that kind of thing. But unlike a lot of Americans, people 500 years ago knew that, and these are just some weird examples, witches could place curses on people. Mice and flies popped into existence randomly. There's a fly flying around this room. A murdered body would bleed in the presence of the murderer. So I guess you could say that was early forensics. People also thought that if you applied ointment to a blade that was used to wound somebody, the wound would heal itself. So voila, no need for stitches. We can just do that. People thought that the shape, color, texture of plants would tell you if it could be used for medicine, and their logic behind that was God created the world to be interpreted by humans. So what appears aesthetically beautiful to people is therefore good for us to use. Now, the vast majority of plants, especially fungi aren't plants, but people back then would have thought that they were, are actually either no good for us or poisonous. So it's really not a good mode of thinking, like not at all. But that goes back to the people. We are smart, clearly, and we can logic and reason. So therefore, whatever our best guess is probably right, and that's not the case. A couple more. Unlike a lot of Americans today, that's a repeat. I'm sorry. People thought that comets were prophets of doom. If you saw a comet in the sky, it meant that a plague was coming, famine was coming, or war was coming. And people that lived in close proximity to each other throughout history went to war with each other for no reason other than they saw a comet and they wanted to attack the other side before they could be attacked. For no good reason at all. People thought that the earth stood still and all objects orbited around that. That went on for a very long time. People thought that the death penalty was appropriate for stealing. The death penalty was used for all kinds of very stupid crimes, like mixing with the wrong socioeconomic class, for example. And then take death off the table, and we have cruel and unusual punishments, torture, for even more mundane things. And people also thought that, this is really disgusting, but people of color were created by God to be subservient to Caucasians. People thought that different colors of people were fundamentally different. They were different in intelligence, different in ability, all this kind of stuff. Totally not true. A couple others. People thought that a monarchy, where you have like a ruling class, a king and a queen or whatever, they thought that those people had a divine right to rule. It was passed down to them from God that they should be the ruler over the kingdom. Therefore, any of the laws that came from the king or queen or whatever were also handed down from God. So that makes it a rule that you just cannot disobey. And what was life like for common folk, for peasant people in this time? Really terrible. They didn't have access to services or food or any of these things. Everybody knew that some external force was controlling their daily life. To the Greeks, it was the various Greek gods. To the Romans, same thing, the Roman gods. Every culture makes up these kinds of mythologies. And they believe that everything happens for a reason. Now, people still say that a lot today, but I don't think that people behave that way necessarily, because we simply know better. If something terrible happens, or if you get sick or something like that, and you simply say, oh, that happens for a reason. Well, to me, that's just an excuse for not doing anything about it, because if it happens for a reason, then it was supposed to happen. So there's nothing you should do or change for the future. And I just think that that's a pretty unfortunate way of thinking. So, couple of examples here. So I'm going to bombard you with statistics, but they're interesting statistics, and they're ones that people should just know, because we grow up in this cushy 21st century environment, and we all have this collective amnesia over what it used to be like and how we got here. So, for example, in 1820, the literacy rate around the entire world was only 12%. Today, it's 83%. In developed countries like the United States, Canada, all throughout Europe, it's so close to 100% that we basically just say it is 100%. And globally, but this progress with literacy starts much earlier. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go from the printing press, the invention of that, to the Enlightenment. And if you don't know what the Enlightenment is, you should look it up. It was a period in the 1700s where human rights started to flourish. So in Great Britain, like a lot of places in Europe, their literacy rate skyrocketed between the 1400s and 1600s. Almost exclusively that had to do with access to books and printing. People were able to read for the first time, which is what that says right there. Now that's not just good for ordinary people, that is good for the scientific process, because scientists need to borrow each other's information. We have to build on previous discoveries to make them better. You think about the airplane. The Wright brothers, their first airplane flight didn't even go 100 yards. And that was in 1906, I think. I think it was 1906. Well, in 1969, we flew all the way to the moon. That's 250,000 miles away. And they came back. So we went from flying 100 yards to 500,000 miles in only a little over 60 years, because we were able to build on each other's progress. Imagine if the Wright brothers couldn't share any of their information. We probably still wouldn't be doing hardly anything with flight today. So here's a graph from a website called Our World in Data. You can see that right there. It's a wonderful place to waste time and just look up interesting statistics. This is the literacy rate. They break it down by many different countries, starting in 1475. So the printing press was invented in 1440, and just look at how this goes up since then. Now, the printing press was invented in Germany by Johannes Gutenberg, so a lot of this literacy started only in Europe, and it took a really long time to spread around. But we look at the world literacy rate, here it is at 12%, and just look at how quickly it has climbed, no doubt due to science. Now, what happens when people become more literate? Well, lots of things. We'll get there. If we look at a timeline of Europe, from the year 500 AD, when the Roman Empire collapses, Rome sort of took over Europe, and then so they lose their control. So now we're looking at just purely European history. There was not a single meaningful advance in science that I can think of that happened for almost an entire millennium. That's really terrible. We get to 1440, and the printing press is invented, and literacy throughout Europe explodes. Now that people can... That fly is still trolling me. Now that people can share books and read and gain their own knowledge and build on prior knowledge, we go very quickly to the Renaissance. So the Renaissance wasn't like, it didn't start on this day and end on that day. It was just kind of a period. But during that period, these greater parts of Europe just flourished like crazy. People became hugely wealthy, and then we have all these amazing works of art. The Statue of David, the Sistine Chapel, all the stuff that Leonardo da Vinci created. Then we have lots of philosophers like Francis Bacon, John Locke, Machiavelli, all kinds of others. So all this stuff goes on with this sharing of ideas. And then we move into the scientific revolution. This started with Nicholas Copernicus. He demonstrated mathematically that the Earth orbits the sun. not the other way around. So the Earth is not the center of the universe. That's a pretty big deal to people to say you're not the center of the universe anymore after they'd believed that for thousands of years. And then with that, towards the end, Isaac Newton writes this book called Principia Mathematica. And in that book, he actually invented calculus. So that type of math is what allowed people to do the kinds of calculations where you can build machines. And so the Industrial Revolution happened because of Isaac Newton. And he only wrote that book because he was trying to explain gravity and planetary orbits. And it created the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution doesn't need to be explained how that's made lives better for people. And then after that, so after and comfort that's come from information and technology and everything, we move on to this wonderful, wonderful period called the Enlightenment. It's a great flourishing of human rights and the adoption of democratic governments. It starts around 1715 with some early works by people. You know, our Constitution, Thomas Jefferson looked at John Locke and other philosophers to inspire them to write the Declaration of Independence and come up with the rights that we have as citizens here. Getting rid of torture as punishment, cruel and unusual punishments, establishing democracies instead of monarchies. So the end date here is sort of the beginning of the French Revolution. You could put the Declaration of Independence as the end date, but whatever. So here is just a graph of the output of manuscripts. So like how many books were written in Europe in each century. And we have pretty much a flat line or nothing really at all going on. And then the progress starts to go up. And then after the printing press, it just soars. So, you know, we're down here in the 11th century to something like 200,000 copies a year to over 5 million. Now that's progress. Now, I asked this question earlier, what happens when people get more literate? Well, this is the homicide rate across Western Europe, where all of this, the Renaissance and all of that occurred. And it goes all the way back to 1300. Look at the way it just plummets. So people get less violent after that. And we can see that there's I don't know what Italy was doing, but we can see that there's kind of a second wave of a decrease in homicide rates. And that comes after the Enlightenment when we establish democracies who have a justice system and courts that are legitimate instead of just handing down capital punishment for stupid reasons. These are the percentages of the world's great powers that are at war. So, you know, like a World War II is when two great powers clash against each other. This goes all the way back to the year 1500, and it's kind of random, but the trend is down. The world is just getting more peaceful as we have these more stable forms of government around, and as people are more enlightened and educated about how to treat one another and things like that. So the opening preamble to the Declaration of Independence, it really is a masterful piece of work, and I believe it was inspired not exactly by scientists, but through the progress brought about by science. And it goes, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. 500 years ago, if you would have told people that everybody should have equal rights, everybody should be protected equally, and that we're all created equally, that was a extremely strange idea to people back then. And even only, you know, we only have to go back 200 years when slavery was going on in this country, and people still, and people still thought that certain people were not equal to other people. So we've had to make a lot of progress since then, but luckily we're pretty much there. Okay, so the second part that we will go over is we've worked our way up to the Industrial Revolution. Now we see what has that done for us. So all the stuff we talked about is kind of old history, so you might be thinking, what has science done for me lately? Well, more statistics. Life expectancy in 1913, it's only 105 years ago, was only 34.1 years. Today, it's 71.4 years. You have an entire additional lifetime. Percentage of children who died before the age of 5 in 1900 was 36%. Today, it's only 4.25%. Now, this is global. If we would look at the United States, this number is much, 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 much lower than 4%. Today, the number of people killed by smallpox from 1900 to 1977 has been estimated at 300 million people. The number of people who have died from smallpox since 1977 is 0. The last ever case of smallpox was reported in 1977. Thanks to vaccines, we've totally eliminated it. We've done almost the same thing with polio, and we think in a couple decades we could get rid of malaria as well. Science also makes us richer. The GDP per capita in this country in 1900 was $6,822. Now that is adjusted for today's money. Today, the GDP per capita in the United States is over $53,000. That's a huge increase. Huge increase. 100 scientists have been were selected, and it's been estimated that they have saved 5 billion lives since the 1800s, and that's through vaccines and just other processes that make the environment safer or cleaner for us. Since 1990 alone, by controlling the 5 most deadly infections, which I don't know what they are off the top of my head, but malaria would probably be one of them, we've saved 100 million children from certain death just in the last 28 years. Incredible. So here are just some people. I'm not going to talk about them, but I seriously doubt you've heard of any of these people. I have never heard of any of these people, but they were in a book I read. This is what their contribution was. So the penicillin, which was discovered by Alexander Fleming, so I don't know what Howard Florey did. The measles vaccine, this guy developed 8 vaccines on his own. These are the number of people since they came up with their study or whatever that have been saved. This is hundreds of millions of people. In fact, that might add up to close to 1 billion people by the works of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 people. Pretty amazing. So here's just a graph of child mortality rate going back to 1800, and just look at how it's plummeted. Now the world is in purple here, so we still have lots and lots and lots of developing places around the world. So the global rate is still much, much higher than you see in the developed countries, where it's so low it's below 1% in most of them. So that's disease. Now we can look at famine. To just show how things have flip-flopped, you take the richest country in the, well, maybe not the richest, but the country with the highest standard of living in the world in 1700 was France. The most malnourished country in the world in 1965, Rwanda. Those people were still better off than people were in France in that year. So the other amazing thing about science is science and technology and all this progress, it doesn't only lift up the wealthy. If you look at the news, they talk about tax breaks and stuff only going to the rich. The 1%, the rich get richer. There's all that kind of stuff going on. But science and technology lifts up the poorest of us. So because of all this, some of the poorest people in the world are living much better lives than the wealthiest people in the world not really that long ago. And that has to be celebrated. Global malnourishment today is 13%. It was 50% in only 1947. Really not very long ago. A combine, so technology, a combine can gather the same amount of grain in 6 minutes that 25 men could manage to gather in an entire day in 1850. It's not just the machine technology, but nitrogen fertilizers are almost entirely responsible for the population boom that happened in the 20th century. There were 1.65 billion people in 1900. today there's about 7.5 billion. And virtually every one of them is alive today only because we can finally grow enough food. We can grow 3 times the amount of food per acre that we could only 100 years ago. In fact, even though we have way more people, about 6 billion more people, the amount of farmland has only increased by 12%. That's it. But the amount of food we can grow increased by around 300%. Here's to illustrate that, here's a graph of population changes throughout the entire world. It goes back to 1760. So we get to 1900 right here. This is basically when nitrogen fertilizers were invented. And look at how, so this line right here is what the actual population is. This red line is showing what's the percentage of change from the previous year. So the fact that this is going up shows that the population is growing at a very fast rate. And we can see that right here. Now there's a lot of doom and gloom out there about there's too many people and we're going to run out of food or space or water or something like that. Now, yeah, there are a lot of people, but what's interesting is ever since 1960, the rate at which the population of the world grows has been declining. So in other words, if you have 2 people and they have 2 children, your growth rate is 0%, so it flatlines. We're not at 0%, we're actually at negative. So for every 2 people on the planet, they're having less than 2 children, is what's going on. Now that wasn't the case for a really long time, but it has been for quite a while. So there we go. This graph just shows the corn yields in the United States. Notice how it's just completely flatlined, and then right before 1940, it just takes off. Irrigation has helped with that, pumping groundwater up, but the fertilizers was a big part of that. This graph shows the percentage of the population who had to be farmers, and it goes all the way back to 1300. So if we look at, and we can take all the way up to 1800, most people had to farm. There was no way for a small group of people to grow and collect enough food for the rest of the population. But today, in the United States, I think the number of people that, United States isn't on here, but if you look at England, the percentage of people who farm is like not even 2%, and they can feed their entire population, and they actually have surplus. They can ship out their food. The United States, we do that. We not only grow enough food for our people, but we sell our beef and our grains to other countries. We have more than enough, even though a tiny fraction of people are producing it. Here's GDP per capita. So you can see that all throughout these countries in the world, it just explodes. Now that people have technology, now that people don't have to grow their own food, we have a really small group of people that can provide the food for everybody. Well, that means that people can do other jobs. So people can become businessmen or salespeople or tradespeople. They can manufacture cars and products and all these kinds of things that we buy and we use to improve the quality of our lives. And look at what it does for people. It just totally lifts everybody up. So when you think of science, we kind of think of like, a scientist in a lab working on something. And all the things I've talked about today, all the progress that's been made with our quality of lives and the rights and things that have been developed, I think there's a pretty strong case that science has done a lot of that work for us. Now, we don't exactly see it happening. It unfolds kind of in the background, slowly over time. But progress can be difficult. So, today we think of science and, what's kind of going on in the world? Today, the only kind of science that gets talked about in the mainstream is stuff like climate change and, climate change is just about the only one that does. But, there's so much more going on. So this, if you don't know what this is CERN. It's a particle collider. It's in Switzerland. If you can't see very well, here's a person on like a scissor lift. So the person is that tall. This is the biggest machine ever made. I think it's 10 miles around. It's a giant loop. They smash subatomic particles together, and they are destroyed. It creates mini black holes and things like that. And we're trying to unlock the fabric of the universe. And it costs billions of dollars to do this kind of thing. And people are probably going to ask a question like, what use is that? Like, what good is this going to do us? And the only answer right now is, we don't know. But a couple hundred years ago, scientists who were tinkering around with this, that, or the other thing, Isaac Newton was just looking at the way planets orbited around the sun, and he tried to just calculate mathematically how that works. And lo and behold, he accidentally ushers in the Industrial Revolution. And look at what has happened to the world since then. It's incredible. So, we don't know yet, but we can't afford not to do these things. We have to be invested in science. It's incredibly important. It's not the only thing. We should be invested in many other things too, like art. Art during the Renaissance lifted up people's perspectives of what it means to be human as well. So it's not just science. It's lots of things. And that's our first discussion. Thanks.